Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Scrubbing the Skies, the webinar series of the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal at American University. As always, I'm your host, Will Burns, and I serve as the co-director of the Institute. So at the outset, let me frame this episode for you. So in the last few years, marine carbon dioxide removal has had a star turn within the larger realm of carbon dioxide removal, with the establishment of a large number of startup companies, primarily in the United States, but also found in other parts of the world, and the emergence from the lab into field experiments for many of these approaches, most prominently ocean alkalinity enhancement. An important question as we move, especially from the lab to field experiments and potential deployment, is the role of public engagement, engaging communities that may be potentially impacted by such activities, both from a positive and a negative perspective, and ensuring that the forms of engagement that we proceed with are not merely an afterthought or a checking the box endeavor. We at the Institute believe that that approach would be both not responsible, nor is it likely to protect the long-term viability of the carbon dioxide removal field. And so we've developed a new report that seeks to provide a detailed roadmap for ensuring effective and ethical engagement in the context of one extremely prominent marine carbon dioxide removal approach, and that's ocean alkalinity enhancement. And that report's title is Engaging Coastal Communities on Ocean Alkalinity Enhancement. And I'm pleased today to have the co-authors of the report with us to summarize its key points, as well as to help us drill down a bit further in terms of the conclusions that they drew. Uh, with us today are Sarah Nawaz, who serves as Director of Research for the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal, and Julia Bellotti, who is a Research Fellow with the Institute. Here's how we'll proceed. We'll initially have an intervention from Sarah and Julia of approximately 10 minutes. I will then proceed with a number of questions to hopefully seed the conversation, and then we will move to audience questions. In that context, I strongly encourage everyone to populate the Q&A box with any questions that you have so that I can scope the amount of time that we want to devote to audience questions and make sure that we get to all of them. And so with that, I will turn over the dais to Sarah.
Great. Thanks so much, Will. Can you all see my screen now?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Well, yeah, thanks so much for the intro, Will. And I'll also say it's just great to do one of these webinars with you because this is our team, this is our institute, and I don't think I've ever done a webinar. So we're always hosting kind of other people's work, and it's great to share some of the stuff we also do. Yeah, so I have put the QR code for the report onto this intro slide. If folks haven't seen it, you can scan it and sort of check it out while we're presenting and chatting. Um, but I will first begin today just by acknowledging that we are currently located in the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations here in British Columbia, where Julia and I are both based. I should say the lower mainland of British Columbia. You know, I mention this because it's a really important practice, I think, to sort of acknowledge in this way the territories we're all based in. And I think, in particularly in this context of community engagement conversations, where a really key message I hope you all take away from today from the presentation and the discussion is just the importance of really connecting and understanding with connecting with and understanding the local context and place that you're hoping to do any type of engagement work in. And of course, the Indigenous peoples that have historically stewarded these lands and continue to today are is just such an important place to kind of begin the conversation from. Um, I'm imagining that a lot of people joining us are already familiar with ocean alkalinity enhancement, but if you are not, we kind of think about it as encompassing two sort of sets of types of processes. The first is called electrochemical-based ocean alkalinity enhancement. The second is more mineral-based. So in the electrochemical approach, you're essentially pulling seawater in and essentially extracting, sort of separating the acidic and alkaline content using sort of electrochemical processes, and then you return the alkaline solution to the ocean, where it then draws down atmospheric carbon dioxide and stores that in the ocean for the long term. And then you have a sort of acid byproduct that you have to store or use in some way. In mineral-based approaches, you're using, you're adding minerals to the ocean to cause that kind of increased capacity for the ocean to draw down and store durably carbon dioxide. So the basic approach is sort of similar in the sense that you're taking advantage of the ocean atmosphere, the ocean kind of carbon cycle to use alkalinity to the advantage of carbon removal. And we also thought it would be good to sort of set the context for today by sharing our thoughts, and I would say our thoughts and also sort of general understanding and best practice in social science around why we do community engagement. And we think about this as having kind of three broad sets of reasons. The first is simply that it's just the right thing to do. So the idea being people, it is ethically good to involve people who will be affected by these types of decisions and projects and technologies in the design and decision making around them. Another reason I think, or set of reasons that doesn't always come up in these conversations or get acknowledged is that community engagement can actually really make your project better or make the development of a technology better, because this goes back to the sort of local knowledge and context piece. People really know their homes and their territories and the specific places where they live. So going and talking to the people that live there or have or work there or recreate there will inform your project in positive ways, make it better anticipate outcomes, impacts, figure out how to like actually get better sort of outcomes in some of the more like carbon relevant dimensions, and so forth. And then I think the third way is it's a really important process for building trust and building legitimacy for a project. But maybe we'll come back to in some of the Q&A around the risks or perils of focusing exclusively on that third reason. We wrote this guide with the hope that it would be of interest to a variety of different audiences. Project developers, developers who are maybe, based at a university, but also potentially a startup or a for-profit company that are looking to do ocean alkalinity enhancement projects. Research consortia, so research groups that are thinking about launching research efforts into ocean alkalinity enhancement. Planners at different sort of levels this might be of interest, as they are folks who are maybe know a lot about engagement already, but less about ocean alkalinity enhancement and some of the challenges that come with engaging people on this particular topic. Environmental and climate NGOs, we found, are groups that are eager to have this conversation, but maybe don't necessarily know as much about how they can then play a role in supporting further conversation. Local community groups, funders as well. We hope this is of interest for funders who might be receiving applications for funding proposals to do either ocean alkalinity enhancement projects or engagement on those projects. So this hopefully will give them a bit of a crash course in how to evaluate some of these proposals. And then again, social scientists, we hope there's not that many social scientists working in this space, and we hope that this can help them in piquing their interest, I would say, in this topic. Come work with us or come take on this topic. It's a growing one, and I think of particular, we need social scientists working on this. So we hope it's helpful for these groups and others, I'm sure, as well. One thought is, I think this definitional question of who are communities is also really key to framing this discussion today. It can mean a lot of different things. And here, what we mean is we mean it to include groups who are already formed around a specific issue. So that could be shellfish farmers, that could be environmental NGOs, that could be recreational user groups, and so forth. The reason that we think it's important to start engagement with these groups is that they are already already organized and can hopefully be an entry point into really understanding what the broader public groups in an area might be thinking about a particular topic. But I think also by communities, we mean generally the public as well in a specific area or where a project or a technology is being considered a possible future deployment site. This is a blurry concept, so we ask you to bear with us in sort of that blurriness, but that's largely who we're kind of referring to with this guide. And I'll say a few brief words about what engagement actually is and could be, and what constitutes sort of meaningful engagement. And this is a spectrum that you may or may not have seen elsewhere. It's kind of a classic way to think about the types of ways that people could participate in decision making. So we've got a spectrum. On the left, we've got just sort of pure outreach. So it's a one-way directional flow of information where someone who wants to do a project, like an OAE project, is just providing information to people about what they want to do. Then we kind of moving along the spectrum, we've got consultation, where maybe there's a two-way flow of information. Now communities are being solicited, their sort of input is being solicited. Then we've got involvement, where maybe community goals and concerns are considered in decisions. And then we've got collaboration, where they're actively partnering to build outcomes. And then we've got what we can call shared leadership, where there's really, community level is where the decisions are being made. And our framing here and our approach is not necessarily to say one is right or wrong, but more to say we generally want to be shifting right along the spectrum towards kind of greater community participation in a project or in decision making about a technology. I think I'm going to turn to Julia to talk us through the next slides.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was a great introduction to the report and what I am about to present on. So why do we have this slide in the first place? Well, because something we often see in the marine carbon dioxide removal space, but also honestly in many, many other spaces that Sarah and I work in, is that when people talk about engaging communities, they also include Indigenous nations by considering them stakeholders. But the issue is that Indigenous nations are not stakeholders. The term stakeholders is actually considered a colonial term. It originates from settlers claiming Indigenous lands. So Indigenous nations are actually rights holders. And this means that tribes and First Nations are sovereign governments, and those a different set of practices applies when it comes to meaningful engagement. We know, for instance, that Indigenous nations are protected under the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, which includes the right to free, prior, and informed consent. And this is something that working in these spaces, we often see people not being really familiar with this concepts and regulations and protocols. So we really invite people to really reflect on the types of rights and acts and agreements that exist in various contexts. Um, so once again, this slide is not meant to be comprehensive. Here are only some of the best practices that we've learned by working with members of tribes, mostly in the US. Here you can see some bullet points. For a first important point is that when engaging with Indigenous nations, we need to have a clear understanding of the history of colonization that has impacted the community, as well as its ongoing impacts. So developing culturally safe and trauma-informed practices really requires the acknowledgement of colonization histories. Another important lesson we learned through conversations with Indigenous leaders is that engaging with Indigenous communities means, first and foremost, building human relationships. We were speaking to an Indigenous person that we engage with, and they told us, it's not about building a business relationship, which is something that, like where we're kind of used to do, but it's rather building a relationship with a kin. So with, like it's like building a relationship with a friend or with a brother or a sister. And these relationships really take time to build, and they must be genuine and not instrumental. So sort of like going back to what Sarah was saying about like, the reasons to do engagement. The third point of this slide is a good reminder that not all Indigenous nations are the same. They don't all have the same protocols and the same priorities, and it's therefore really important to always co-develop engagement priorities with them. And something must also be said about values and worldviews. There is a very Western-centered way of knowing that most of us, especially if scientists and researchers are used to, but this is by no means the only form of knowledge that exists. And when engaging with Indigenous nations, it's really important to recognize that there are multiple ways of knowing, and they're all valuable. And Indigenous nations across the world, as Sarah was mentioning, when doing the land acknowledgement, have been stewards of the land since time immemorial. And there are many things that can be learned from Indigenous knowledge. And the last point we have here, it's something I already briefly touched upon, and it's the fact that there are many existing protocols and agreements, and they differ from nation to nation. So it's really important to keep them into consideration when engaging with Indigenous communities. And once again, this is not an exhaustive list, and we really invite everyone to do their research and educate themselves about what to consider when engaging with Indigenous nations. So next slide. Thanks so much, Sarah. So I am now going to briefly go through the 10 best practices that we have identified in our report. I will try to give an overview, and then if you have further questions, we can tackle them during the Q&A. So first, as you prepare for engagement, it is always a good idea to find potential partners in the community. The partners you identify in the early stages are likely going to determine how the rest of the engagement process goes. So the first step is actually quite important. You might want to partner with an entity or an organization that is trusted in the community and that has a good history of public engagement. And just as important as identifying potential partners, there is the need to identify relevant participants. And something that can be done here is first building a community map. So doing a stakeholder and rights holders analysis. And this means usually, what we do is we do a lot of research about groups in the community that who should be at the table. But this means also talking to people and actively going to community events, for instance, to try to understand which groups should be involved. And this is quite a delicate phase, I would say, and we can talk more about it. But the risk is basically to reiterate existing power dynamics by only engaging very vocal groups or groups that are already quite present in the community. And the risk, of course, is also shadowing voices that are maybe less organized or more marginalized. So it requires a lot of care and time and attention. In the context of OAE, some of the groups that you might really want to engage with are local fishermen and coastal indigenous communities, but also ocean conservation folks and marine scientists and policymakers. Another fundamental lesson that should be applied in OAE community engagement is really knowing the history of the community. So do your homework. Think about questions such as, have there been any instances of injustices associated with other climate or non-climate projects? Who does the community trust, and what is the perception of coastal industries? So, for instance, does the community have a good relationship with tourism or shipping or aquaculture? So all these questions are very important because they might help you anticipate what the community concerns might be in relation to ocean alkalinity enhancement. So in the next slide, Our 4 point is something that we are never going to stress enough. Sarah and I always talk about this, and it's please, please, please do engage people very early in the process. Why is that? For the simple reason that if you go to a community and you already have your project draft and your plan for your marine carbon dioxide removal deployment, community members are going to tell you, okay, so what are we doing here? Are you simply asking for our approval? Are you just trying to legitimize a decision that has already been made? And basically, at that point, it's just much harder to integrate the community's feedback. And more generally, it becomes less of a process of co-development and more a mere consultation. And again, a reminder of the participation letter that Sarah was presenting earlier. The next point is really take care in framing the conversation. We all know that explaining exactly what OAE and marine carbon dioxide removal is quite complex. Not they're not straightforward concepts for most people. And we can definitely talk about it later about some strategies for conveying complex topics and themes. But mostly our advice is to simplify concepts to avoid overwhelming the audience, but also at the same time being transparent and not omitting information. And following, we have another important lesson, which is try to discuss multiple dimensions of ocean alkalinity enhancement approaches. One mistake that we often see, and it's often made, is for project developers or whoever is leading the engagement to only focus on one vision of the technology, maybe because that's what's going to be proposed in the specific context. But the issue here is that this is quite limiting because it prevents the community from learning more about all the nuances of OAE technologies, and it also prevents them from expressing preferences that may differ from the specific technology configuration that is being deployed in that community or thought about in that for that specific context. Um, so related to this point, we have in the next slide a lesson concerning scale. So it's really important to help communities grasp the full potential of scale for OAE projects. Truth be told, people tend not to care much about the small field trial that you're planning on the coast. They might care about it a little bit, but the first question Sarah and I always receive when we do engagement session is, okay, what about this project at scale? What about the next steps? And once again, here it's really important to be transparent about how this first phase of the project might inform next stages and how the implication of a project at larger scales may differ from a pilot scale. The next lesson is one of my favorite one as a social and political scientist, and it's really to place the social political context front and center. We all know that technologies are never neutral. All technologies and approaches like OAE are really value-laden, and they're embedded in socio-political contexts that are also not neutral. So people are very concerned about questions like, who funds these projects, but especially who profits from them. Is this project about a greedy corporation profiting off the community? Is it about university researchers taking advantage of the community for their academic goals? So communities will have questions about it, and it's important to tackle them transparently and to bring them up instead of pretending they just don't exist. We're almost at the end of the list. Our best practice number 9 is really be prepared to manage group dynamics. I would love to talk about this a little bit more if you have any questions about it. But if you've ever conducted engagement activities or facilitated workshops or focus groups, then you probably know that some voices are inevitably louder than others. They tend to carry the conversation in certain directions, and they might indirectly silence other voices. So it's really important to avoid this by maybe establishing some ground rules and adopting other strategies to really avoid it. And last but not least, engagement can also be fun and it can also be dynamic. We are working in the climate solution space. We're trying to do our best to imagine different futures and different worlds, not only from a technical perspective, but also from a social political standpoint. And it's really good to do that through games and scenarios and fun conversations that can really be engaging for communities. And that's also a great way to give people more agency as we do these engagement processes. I will pause there because I realize that there's a lot that we could dive deeper into. But yeah, we're really excited to hear your questions and just discuss together. So back to you, Will, to open the conversation.
All right. Thank you, Sarah and Julia. And so, yes, I'll ask a couple of initial questions, and now I encourage everyone to populate the Q&A box, and then we'll proceed to those questions. You've both conducted public engagement exercises on MCDR approaches, and that's fairly rare in this field. And so I have a few opening questions based on your experience. First question is, what's been the most challenging scientific and technological aspects of OAE to work through with the communities that you've engaged with? And do you feel that the communities ultimately were comfortable with these concepts and understood them a bit more, right? Because we're talking about some pretty abstruse science, right? Even for those of us that are social scientists working in this field, right? Much less communities. So, what have been your experiences of really hard things to concepts to explain and your experience of whether you think you were successful?
Yeah, this is a great place to start, Will. Thanks. I think OAE is a really tricky one, and this, like, as CDR approaches go, having worked on other things like DAC projects, it's so much easier to explain something like there's a machine or a reactor and it like pulls in air and it removes the CO2, and then you have this like concentrated quantity of CO2 and you put it somewhere. Whereas with OAE, I think the marine carbon cycle piece that is really complex and hard for folks to grasp, hard for me to grasp, I would say. That's a real challenge. I think there are ways to sort of if simply go through it, but I do think that finding modes, whether that's like video formats or really clear like panel by panel slide descriptions that you can provide are all helpful. I will share that we've been for a project we're doing, we've been working with a firm to put together a 10-minute video explainer on ocean alkalinity enhancement. And I will say that I was struck with how challenging it was, and also how much deeper I understand ocean alkalinity enhancement having gone through that process. Um, so I think the more that we as a community in the sense of like a scientific community or a research community can pool resources and come up with shared resources that we can share in that way. So maybe this video, hopefully it's of use to other people once we release it, and other folks can go and share it at one of their workshops where we kind of talk through these are like the underlying scientific processes that you need to understand to really grasp OAE. So that kind of thing, hopefully that is of use to others. But yeah, I think there's going to be a need for iterating on that and doing other types of things like that.
Okay. Anything to add in that context, Julia?
No, I think that's a great answer. It always strikes me how, like some of the most difficult concepts for people to grasp when it comes to OAE is, how is it possible that you're basically increasing the ocean's capacity to absorb CO2, and you're also telling me that that is contrasting ocean acidification. So it's really by nature OAE is just it's not an easy approach to understand. And really the strategies that Sarah was presenting and mentioning just now are all great strategies, really like making the information digestible for people.
Okay. Okay. One of the things that you discuss in the report is the use of scenario exercises, right? To try to project out what this would look like on a larger scale, right? And you emphasize, I think, quite correctly that it's sensible and ethical to do so. But one question I was curious about is in those scenario exercises. Do you present the idea of risk trade-offs, right? Because obviously, all of these approaches, as does any intervention in the context of climate change, carries risk, right? But we also realize that in a lot of cases, it's worth taking that risk because unchecked climate change obviously poses serious risks, including to the marine environment, though one can carry that too far, right? And so I'm wondering, do you incorporate any discussion of that in the scenario exercises? And if so, how?
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is, I would say, can be one of the benefits of a scenario approach is that implicit in thinking through what the future could look like with or without OAE, you are getting at that risk trade-off piece. Because I think if you just sort of say to people, hey, what do you think about this new thing that does this thing? It's easy for people to fixate on the fears they have potentially or the concerns they have just outside of the future reality or the future trajectory we're on, which is, as we all know, like really bad for the climate. So I think that, there's that can be, and it's not to say that, a scenario and exercise would inherently do this, but I do think if done well, a scenario exercise can really highlight trade-offs between non-action and OAE, but also different types of OAE and different like other types of arrangements that could be in place. So I think that that's one of the benefits of a scenario exercise is really highlighting the trade-offs that may exist between all different dimensions that we're talking about here.
Okay.
I want to add something to that, Will, that might clarify this a little bit further. And it's the fact that, yeah, as Sarah was saying, the scenarios are really meant to make people think through these trade-offs. And an example I can give you is the example about discharging something into the ocean. So at the very beginning of the workshops, we tell people what OA is, and we tell them, well, like you discharge alkalinity. And the first reaction is, oh my, this is terrible. Like you're putting something into the ocean, right?
Right.
It's a sort of like defensive stance of what are you doing to our coastal, ecosystems, right? After the scenario exercise, the same participants very often, when we ask them to reflect on, what they've learned and what the scenario exercise is, really like what lessons and what reflections they led to, they tell us, well, I thought about it. And actually, right now, we are putting a lot of stuff in the ocean, right? Like we're putting microplastics and chemicals, and there's shipping fuels, and there's all the pollution associated with that. So actually, now that I've done the exercise, I think that, like that risk concept you were bringing up, right? People are like, well, actually, alkalinity, like OAE is actually trying to do the opposite. We're trying to, they see it differently, which to me is really interesting. So that's what the scenario exercises might also do.
And I would say that beyond scenario exercise, I think anything that gets people to not just have like a initial quick reaction to something, but a more deliberative sort of opportunity to think through something with information and then also put it in conversation, getting conversation with their colleagues is really useful for doing exactly that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I guess I would add that one has to be careful not to go too far with that because one of the things that I don't like sometimes, and I hear this more probably with solar radiation management deliberations, but presenting these Manichaean choices, right? It's either
Yeah.
solar radiation management or runaway climate change, right? Because there's also far more dedicated decarbonization, right, as something, and so it's important, I think, to ensure that all of those things are in the mix, right, and I know looking at your exercises, you've done that, but I think it's a good thing for people to remember. We shouldn't never present this as either the world goes to hell if we don't do MCDR or yeah. Um, what's been the most interesting sort of question or questions that have arisen from participants during the exercises that you've conducted?
I can jump in here, and it's not really about a question, Will, but it's really something that speaks to the trust point that Sarah and I were briefly touching upon earlier. So we had an instance of, we were conducting workshops with the general public, and people really were expressing a clear mistrust in institutions, but also they were not trusting us as researchers.
Yeah,
And we're in this room with cameras, and they thought we were videotaping them to
right.
then give the videotape to the project developer.
Yeah,
That was for Sarah. So they kept asking us, are you video recording us? They knew we were audio recording them for the research, but they kept asking us, are you video recording us? And I think it was really surprising to all of us because I think it was the one of the first times we've encountered such a lack of trust. And but it was really, really, and it was an awakening moment, I guess, for all of us, right? In terms of really realizing that this is not an easy conversation to have with people. And especially with certain general public groups, and it might really lead to strong reactions. I feel like in the same group, we had a lot of instances of like sarcasm and people joking about the technology and trying to joke about the company and depicting the developer, the project developer as like a villain or the enemy or like this, yeah, cartoon villain and making jokes about the name. So that was really surprising for us. I don't know, Sarah, if you have anything else to add about other like surprising episodes that we've experienced while doing engagement.
No, I don't think so. I think that's a good one.
yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. All right, I could go on forever, but I want to get to audience questions in a second. So I have one more question that's always a burning one for me. So, I alluded earlier to the fact that I think quite correctly you say that in public engagement exercises, one should not only be discussing the potential impacts of the experiment itself, which is often or almost always extremely small in scale, but the potential ramifications of full-scale deployment or larger deployment of the approach. But another question that often arises from publics in these kind of processes is an issue that's even more globalized, which is the moral hazard issue, right? If you did this at a really large scale, are we going to think this is a protective umbrella that permits us to stop really focusing on decarbonizing the economy? And we're really concerned about that, right? And I think that's a really difficult question for anybody just conducting a field experiment, a project developer, or even if they were going to deploy this at full scale, because they don't have the agency to be able to ensure that we don't take our foot off the pedal in terms of decarbonizing, right? That's in the hands of policymakers, right? So has that issue arisen for you, and how do you think it should be approached from a standpoint of discussing it?
Do you want to go, Julia, or should I jump in?
Yeah, I can start addressing this. Yes, Will, this is a very challenging question. And I think it also speaks to the fact that when it's researchers like us doing, like Sarah and myself doing the engagement, and this is something we haven't talked about yet, but the very first premise should be how you're using the results of the workshops and of the engagement, right? So as researchers, we always need to make sure that people we're engaging with and communities we're engaging with understand that it's not going to be possible for us to directly integrate their feedback into a specific project because once again, we are the researchers, right? So I'm mentioning that point because we always need to be very transparent about what we can do and what we can't do. and our positionality in doing so, right? Whereas I think when it's policymakers, for instance, doing this kind of work and this type of work, then there's a different sort of like power relation at play there in terms of like, okay, we could actually, or developers even, right? We could actually integrate some of your feedback and comments into this. But when it comes then to your question of how do we make sure that, how do we answer people's question about moral hazard? I feel like there's not really a perfect solution to that. It's just about, making sure to be very transparent about your intentions. And also what Sarah and I usually say is, hey, we're not advocating for carbon dioxide removal without mitigation, without a clear pathway towards like mitigation first, or simultaneously at least. So I feel like the transparency piece is key. And being transparent means also being clear about the fact that this is not something that we can solve as, like in that specific engagement, in that specific workshop. Sarah, I don't know if you want to answer this in a different way.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great set of thoughts, Julia. I mean, I think maybe one other thing I would add is I do think that moral hazard is a really complex umbrella term that refers to a lot of different things, or mitigation deterrence. I think there are some pieces that are just very abstract and like no one could ever, like no project developer or research consortia could ever um yeah, pin down like and commit to something on that. But I do think there are also aspects of that topic of mitigation deterrence that really that where the commitments could be made, whether that's, we're never going to partner with certain groups, or we're going to take, we're not just going to like be bought out by a fossil fuel company in the future. Like we've got an internal commitment to that. Or, we're gonna, we're going to set certain other guardrails around our activities and the way they open up new like mining activities in the future, for example. I mean, we often think about moral hazard and mitigation deterrence in the context of increased fossil fuel use, but I think also extractive industries more broadly, that's a thing. We know in the marine context, questions about deep sea mining, are you going to go and do stuff offshore? And then that opens the
Right.
gateway into more deep sea mining, which is a concern for lots of folks,
Yeah.
or terrestrial mining. We're going to do mineral-based OAE, and we're going to have to do all this new mining associated with it. So commitments around like actually this community or these communities really were okay with exploring further mineral-based OAE, but if it happens with repurposed mining materials, waste products, and not sort of opening new mines, like that kind of thing, I think you can also make project-based commitments around potentially.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Something that for people to think about. Okay, let me move to some audience questions. First one's from Zachary Price, who's been engaged with OAA projects. And his question is, he said, in doing OAA permitting a year ago, we thought we contacted all stakeholders, did press releases, met with tens of people, and still 6 months later, certain groups said they weren't informed. How do you ensure that all groups are informed?
It's a very long and ongoing process, I have to say. It usually takes us, I think almost a year to make sure that almost everyone is there. And then, when we do reiterations of the same engagement, we also find out that there were certain groups that we hadn't involved. Usually what we do in practice is we approach is through the outreach through a sort of like two phases that are sort of like reiterative. The first one is we do desk research about, groups in the community that we think we should reach out to. And then once we reach out to them, we ask them, okay, who else should be at the table? And that's how we start our stakeholder and rights holders mapping. So we have a first map on paper, let's say, and then we talk to people and we're like, okay, what groups do you collaborate with? What groups do you think would be interested in knowing more about this project or about this technology and approaches? And that creates a sort of snowballing effect that really helps us make sure that I don't want to say all groups, that's an ideal world, but
Right.
many, many of the groups are there, right? It's so
Yeah.
it's almost impossible, I would say, to have 100% to get it 100% right and then get all the groups at the table. But the sort of like snowballing effect has really helped. Usually having someone in the community who can help you with the outreach and making sure that everyone is there. Is there anything to add about it?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that a couple things. One is, I think if we are getting to the, I wonder whether, and this is a question, I wonder whether this response of we weren't informed is less, hey, you didn't tell us something, but more you didn't involve us early enough. Because I see that the
Right.
question also mentions we were doing permitting for an OAE project. And I wonder if that's really what was going on, was that people wanted to know earlier, and that's really what they were trying to say. I will also, though, turn to another question that I'm seeing in the Q&A chat, which I think gets to a really interesting piece of this, of how do you balance, engaging communities early and also having enough of like a concrete thing to plan to talk to them about. I think
Right.
that's a really great question and one that is tricky. And I would say that that is where to get a bit more big picture for the sort of our MCDR, OAE, CDR community, scientific research community. Um, I would argue that and I have argued this in different pieces that that I've written or co-authored, we really need to be having a conversation about these technologies, ideally early, like really early, before individual projects are either going out to engage communities that might be affected by their work or doing like permitting activities. I think to the extent to which we can have there be already existing general knowledge and understanding and opinions and views and perspectives on this subject before a developer is coming in, that will be, I think that will be quite useful for striking this balance. Because yeah, it is really hard to go to people and say we want to do this thing, and actually we have no idea exactly what we want to do. It's really hard to organize people around that. But if someone else has already talked to them about the potential for this thing, um, that can potentially work a lot better.
Great. Another question. Are communities thinking about OAE as only focused on mitigation, or are there potential connections with adaptation being brought up?
That is a great question. Um, when we do engagement with folks, I feel like they do see OAE and in general carbon dioxide removal as its own category. So they don't really think about OAE as mitigation. They don't really, I cannot really think about on the top of my head any connections with adaptation that have been brought up by communities at the moment. Sarah, you might have any, but I don't really, I can't think of anything except
Yeah.
some questions that we've been asked about, like what about sea level rise? Like these are coastal infrastructure, so people have asked me about like, earthquakes or tsunami, like how do we make this infrastructure like more yeah, like resilient to that potentially, but that's a common question for like coastal infrastructure in general. And the clear connection with mitigation is oftentimes, like the moral hazard situation, but also could we potentially co-develop OAE or other marine carbon dioxide removal infrastructure with renewable energy. So people are really interested in exploring the potential of having carbon dioxide removal coupled up and paired up with renewable energy infrastructure. Especially people in the Pacific Northwest, they were asking us, okay, could we have an OAE facility and tidal energy together or offshore wind together? That makes it more acceptable for people to think about, and I think that's also good. To go back to the previous question, I think people find it more interesting to talk and be engaged about CDR and like more conventional mitigation infrastructure and technology rather than just being engaged on CDR, which can be a little bit abstract for them. I'll stop here, Sarah. I know you wanted to jump in.
Oh, nothing doubt I was going to kind of go in the direction you already went. But Devin, that's a really interesting question and would love to chat more about it. Yeah.
Okay. Next question, kind of a challenge here. How do you intend to speak transparently to communities when you're oversimplifying it in just your presented explanation? Isn't calling the mining for OAE as just, quote, gathering minerals disingenuous and misleading?
Ooh, love it. Great.
That's what we're here
So
for.
this is what we're here for. Yeah. I mean, I would say that there is no like perfectly neutral explanation that you can provide. There's no perfect explanation. Um, I would say that gathering minerals is accurate in the sense that you aren't necessarily doing mining for OAE. So mineral-based OAE can be done using like requiring new mining activities, or it can be done using mine tailings or other waste products that don't require new mining. But I think the broader point is really important to bring up that, what you include or don't include, the way that you articulate things or don't articulate things, the words you use, like natural or unnatural, the analogies you draw, whether that's comparisons to trees or comparisons to other kind of things that we know people love. People love trees, in case you didn't know, which you probably knew. All of that really matters. And I think this is part of why, not to go on down a sort of rabbit hole, but why survey research is really fantastic, but also really challenging to do well and can be best understood when complemented with kind of qualitative research, like the sort of engagement work we're describing here in a sort of more academic research sense. Um, Getting the opportunity to really talk to people in detail about what is involved is something that is important and useful because it is hard to represent all the nuance in just a quick paragraph overview of these technologies. So yeah, great point. Thanks for bringing it up.
I
Yeah.
also want to add something to this, which is that sometimes simplifying doesn't mean misrepresenting necessarily. For instance, something that Sarah and I have found quite effective is having these analogies. So, for instance, when we're to your point, to the point of the person who asked the question, when describing mining at scale or like the mining, like the material needed for OEE at scale, for mineral-based OEE at scale, Sarah and I have these analogies where we say, okay, so for instance, this would require two-thirds of the outputs of the largest mine in BC, just to give people an idea. And then we give the name of the mine so that people can look it up, for instance, right? So we're like, okay, think about this mine existing in BC, in your community or like in your region or province. Uh, OAE at this scale would require this much mining. This, I consider this as a sort of like simplification in the sense that you're helping people grasp the concept of like, instead of saying like this much tons, you're giving them two-thirds of this existing, of the output, annual outputs of these existing miles. But it gives people a clear idea. And I feel like it's quite transparent in the sense that we're not trying to hide how much material it will be needed to do this processes.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And one of the things you point out in the report is one has to be careful, obviously, with analogies too, right? When you equate everything with natural, right? It's a framing, right? And it may be one that leads to a deceptive framing of the issues, right? So figuring out what are ethical analogies and simplifications and what aren't, right, is a challenge, right? Always, especially in a 6 hour format, right? So there's obviously always imperfections in this process. So I don't see any other questions here, so I'm going to ask you another follow-up question myself. In the report, you indicate at one point that it's crucial, quote, to establish clear boundaries around your role in community engagement when working with an OAE project developer, right? So I think this was somebody that would be leading a public engagement, and you need to create a bit of a boundary between yourself and the project developer. But the question I have is, often what I've seen in these cases is there's a project developer that hires a public engagement shop to do their work. And I'm wondering in those cases, aren't we indulging a fiction that there's any boundary, right? Because if you're being hired, there's some pressure on you, perhaps to define things in certain ways. And does that necessarily mean that project developers should not be helming these investigations, and that rather it should be done through NGOs or government shops? What do you think about that? And is that realistic? Because a lot of times the only folks that have the money to do this, it seems, are the project developers.
Yeah, that's a great question. Oh, I can start and then Julia, you can cover what I don't cover. So many thoughts in response to that question, Will. I think this goes maybe to my earlier point around in an ideal world, I think we would be, and I think that ideal world, some version of that I do believe is possible, is there is some baseline engagement that has occurred. So communities are not just having a developer come in and talk to them about something they've never heard before. And they've already kind of collectively begun to think through these technologies and how they fit in with their future development of their region. And now they're kind of equipped with understanding, with just like experience, envisioning the policies that they'd like to see in place. And so they are perhaps more capable of really a kind of, yeah, they don't need as much, they don't need as much of like an independent actor to be shepherding the process. I will still
Mhm.
say I do think that having an outside independent actor lead engagement is generally a desirable thing. It's like something we should be trying to orient towards. Um, something else I wanted to say. I mean, I guess more generally, something that a kind of a company or a developer or research consortium could do is be very, very transparent about how engagement will be used. So any outcomes, any findings, like what happens with that? Will it be collected and published somewhere or shared online somewhere?
Mhm.
How will those results get incorporated into decision making? I think committing up front before the work begins about what that kind of sharing out will look like, and what kind of, how it will all be incorporated is really important. And then actually following up and doing that is also really important. But yeah, I'll stop, Julia, if you have thoughts you want to add.
Yeah, no, Sarah, I think you covered everything. That point of transparency and being clear about your positionality, that's really, really key, especially if you're the developer. And I do believe there have been examples in the field of developers, project developers, that have been quite good at doing that. And I think that Ebb Carbon, for instance, is a great example. It often gets brought up. They really developed transparent and clear and honest relationships with the indigenous communities with tribes in the area, to the point that they were donated salmon from the tribes to experiment on, to make sure that their processes would not harm the salmon. That's a clear example of a sort of like two-way engagement and constant communication between the project developer and the communities and indigenous communities in the area, in terms of, what Sarah was saying, right? Like, are you going to actually integrate what we're asking? Are you going to make sure that our concerns are actually attended to and our questions will be answered? Clearly that's clearly important if it's a developer doing the engagement.
Okay. All right. I think we're almost done. So I guess I'd ask, are there any parting thoughts? I'd also emphasize that there's a link to the report in the chat, and I'd encourage everybody to take a look at it, because there's a lot more to no pun intended, to mine in this context. Any parting thoughts, Sarah or Julia?
I mean, I would just say it's cool and exciting to see folks coming to want to talk about this. I feel like it's a topic that's gotten a lot more appreciation in the past couple of years, and that's really great to see. And I think I'm looking forward to reading what other people are doing in this space and what other kind of engagement activities happen in the future, and learning from others who are I think beginning to think about doing this more and more. So excited to see what's ahead.
Great.
Yeah, similar to that, Sarah, I would say feel free to reach out. Let's have this conversation. It's a learning process. This is not a tick box exercise. This is just the beginning of something that we are trying to do together, and we're still also trying to learn. It's a lot of trial and error, not just in the science and the applied science of things, but also in the social sciences. So really feel free to reach out. Let's have conversations and learn together. And yeah, thank you for coming to this. It's great to see people interested in the topic.
All right. First of all, I'd like to thank both Sarah and Julia for your presentations and thank our audience for thoughtful questions as always. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, so stay tuned in all the places that we normally announce on that. And once again, I'd like to thank everyone and look forward to seeing you in the future. Have a great rest of the day. Goodbye now.